Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week we're going to be talking about the direction of Rails, where it's going, where it's come from. But before we get started, let's introduce our panel. We have James Edward Gray from Gray Productions. He's worked on things like Scout and a few other handy tools like Faster CSV. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Thank you.
We also have Aaron Patterson from the Rails core team. He works for AT&T Interactive. He's contributed a few little-known libraries like Nokogiri, and we'll welcome him as well.
Thanks.
We have David Brady from ADD Casts from Shiny Systems, and he's contributed a few things, including an interesting library called Tourbus that you can use to do load testing and stuff on your applications.
Yep.
And finally, we have Peter Cooper from the Ruby Show, the JavaScript Show, Ruby Inside, Ruby Weekly, JavaScript Weekly, and probably a few other things that I've forgotten.
And I submitted one patch to Rails once, and it's in Rails. How awesome is that? One patch, baby!
Nice. And I'm Charles Max Wood from TeachMeToCode.com. I'm also the host of the Rails Coach podcast. TeachMeToCode.com has screencasts and podcasts. And I am getting ready to launch a Rails summer camp that you can sign up for at teachmetocodeacademy.com.
Ooh?
Yeah, you heard it here first.
Wow.
So,
is that the future of Rails?
I don't know about that. Rails moves kind of fast. So, there's been a bit of discussion out there. I don't know if you guys have been following some of it. There was a guy named Steve Coast that wrote, "What the hell is happening to Rails?" and kind of went on a rant. And then Yehuda Katz replied to some of the discussion. I'm kind of interested in you guys' take on some of the changes that we've seen in Rails lately.
Who said what now?
I guess I don't know if I can summarize it really. Some guy was like, "Oh no, Rails is getting for..." What was the summary of his article? Like, it's not for new people anymore or something like that?
That was the general gist was, well, there were a couple of things. One was that it moves too fast so nobody can get good documentation around it. And the other argument was, that the Rails core team is adding their pet technologies to it, and it's becoming harder to learn. So everybody go back to Rails 2, learn Rails 2, and then learn Rails 3.
I don't know about that.
It's an interesting point. Yeah, I think I'm skeptical of it too, although I can sympathize with it in some areas. So, like, for example, let's just take resource routing. If we look at resource routing in Rails, well, that's usually, to step up to that, you got to learn a few things. You got to learn how to declare the route. You got to learn which routes it defines by default, which ones you're supposed to send where, what if you need to do special routes, things like that. Whereas if you go back to Rails when it did basically, what was it, action ID, controller action ID, ///. That was pretty darn easy to learn. You passed a hash to all the URL methods and stuff like that. Now, I'm not arguing the old way was better. I think the new way does have plenty of advantages, for it, but it probably does add a bit to the learning curve that's going on, right? And I think that's just one example. I think there are others where, it's Rails, for being a framework that's famous for being very easy to get into, probably has grown up a little in some areas, and maybe that is requiring a bit more to get under your belt, which, if it's worth it, is probably okay. And, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. And if it requires us more to learn about how web applications work and stuff like that, I assume that's also a good thing. But I'm very interested to hear the other thoughts too, though.
Yeah. Well, I think as soon as you start adding any new pieces of tech, that's something new for people to learn. I mean, we can't just stay with the old stuff forever. And also the other thing I want to say about it is you don't have to use it, right? Like, you can go ahead and use Rails 3.1 without ever learning anything about CoffeeScript if you like.
Hold on a second. I got to put another quarter in this phone or it's going to cut me off.
I was actually going to say there's a little bit of noise in the background there.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. My take on this is a little bit interesting. Well, and it really just brings out more questions because, Steve Coast kind of says, well, it's harder for new people. But, my take is which new people? Because we have people who are converting from things like PHP or, some of these other frameworks that are out there from Python or Django or this or that. And then you have the people who are new to programming and new to web development, and they're just picking this stuff up. And I'm thinking, okay, well, if you were just coming over from another web development framework or language, then, yeah, there's a little bit more to know about, as far as CoffeeScript and Sass and the routing and things like that. But, that's all part of the framework. But if you're new to web development anyway, then things like Sass and CoffeeScript actually make it a lot easier because it abstracts away some of the ugly parts of those technologies like JavaScript and Sass that or CSS that have their warts that are a little harder to deal with.
I think that Sass especially is I assume one of the main complaints in the article was targeted at the asset pipeline, just because it does change, how several things are done. Sass seems pretty simple to me, just because it's, pretty much you can use it and still have normal CSS right in there, so not really a big deal there. CoffeeScript is maybe a bit more debatable in that, if you're really going to use CoffeeScript, then you probably do need to spend a little bit more time, learning yet another language. And, it kind of gets annoying of how many languages do we need to display one frickin' web page, but I think there's a little bit of that syndrome. What about, with the asset pipeline, I think that's an interesting choice for additions to Rails, just because it really does add a lot as far as structure and stuff. Aaron, can you tell us what you think about that, about the asset pipeline? Is it really going to be as great as it looks, or is it, really trying to do too much?
Well, I think some of the technology in it is actually important. Well, is very important. Much of the technology is important, but the stuff that I think is immediately useful is, for example, the compression stuff and putting assets together. That's stuff that we actually do in production with all of our websites, but it's not built into Rails. We had to use third-party stuff to deal with it. So I'm actually pretty excited about those particular things in the asset pipeline. How it'll play out, moving our apps to it, I am not 100% sure. I'm not going to know until I actually do the work. So,
Interesting. Now I'm going to give you a low pitch because you've done a lot of work on bug fixes and performance in Rails 3. That when Rails 3 first came out, there was a really big performance hit that people took upgrading from Rails 2 to Rails 3. And it seems like you've worked some of that out. I'm a little curious as to where those problems were and why they were willing to release a Rails 3.0 that was actually slower than Rails 2.
Well, it depends. So the problem is one of the major performance issues I dealt with was in Active Record, and the problem is the actual performance degradation was an n squared graph. But the problem is you don't if you're running very small iterations, your n value is very small, you won't actually notice, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the thing is it's not that we were willing to release a slower one, it's just that we didn't know it was slower. So
I told you.
Yeah.
Till somebody tried to really use it.
Exactly, yes. So, one of the things that somebody else has pointed out a speed regression in 3.1, and we're not going to release 3.1 without this particular regression taken care of. But one of the things I want to do in the future is start we need to start having benchmarks and benchmarking them over time. Like we have some benchmarks in Rails itself, like, you know, benchmark this and that, but we don't actually run them on like a regular basis and then track the values over time. Because really, like, I think that's the only way you can detect these sorts of performance degradations. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question very well, but that's my thoughts on it.
I think it does give us a good idea, just because, you know, yeah, you didn't know, but at the same time, I guess it does bring up the point that you're making, that, you know, hopefully you're testing the benchmarks in the future so that at least if we're going to take some kind of performance hit, that we're aware of it. Yeah, and we know if we're going to take a performance hit, we should at least know what it is and, like, you know, why. Yeah.
I mean,
so go ahead.
I was going to say that while, you know, people are complaining that Rails is getting worse in some areas as far as, like, you know, for a newbie to get in, I do think it's getting better in some areas. And the one I would name is just the code, I think, is more accessible these days. Like, there's some parts where it's gotten worse, like the stack has definitely gotten deeper, and that makes it a bit harder to track. But that when they switched away from heavy metaprogramming to you know, breaking everything out into modules and just including those in the right places and letting Ruby's method call system work like it's supposed to work, I think Rails got much easier to understand at that point. So I'm hoping that makes contributing and stuff more popular, easier to get into.
Readability has definitely gotten better in 3.0, in my opinion. Some of the asset pipeline I'm not super excited about, but we'll fix that over time, I guess.
Well, I think that's one thing that we see with our development processes too, is that I never write pretty code the first time. I usually wind up writing ugly code and then fixing it. So
yeah, I mean, as long as that's the thing, is like, as long as we have tests, you know, we have tests for it and it works. So now that we've gotten it working, then we start moving on to the refactor step, right? I mean, that'll be the refactor step of our, you know, red green cycle. So, I mean, it's not the prettiest to read, but you can get through it if you know, dedicate a few minutes.
Yeah. So
go ahead. Sorry, Chuck.
No, it's okay. I really want to see what speculations people have as far as things that, you know, maybe we would like to see in Rails 3.2 that isn't coming in Rails 3.1. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Oh, boy. I did, but I think that somebody else should go first.
More cowbell.
No cowbell?
No, more cowbell.
More cowbell. That's right.
Yeah.
I don't know what we're going to see in Rails 3.2. Obviously, I don't have Aaron's inside peek. I was trying to think of what I want to see in Rails 3.2, and I don't find myself coming up with like 50 immediate things that I want to throw out there. So I take that as kind of a good sign. I think maybe the one thing I would like to see Rails get into a bit, you know, there's lots of systems like this, but Heroku's new setup where they use is it called the proc file, I think, through Foreman, where you set up various processes. I think that's pretty much a requirement of any non-trivial Rails application, that you're going to have, you know, at least a background working process or something like that. And I would love to see Rails get a little bit into just making it easier to set something like that up, or maybe giving different ways to load the Rails environment. Like in the background worker, you know, you generally don't need the entire stack, you know, just the database side would be enough, or giving us ways to even load on slimmer environments and stuff like that for an API or setup like that. And I know that we do have those tools, like through, you know, Metal and the router, which is definitely improved. But I think seeing Rails get into that and make it something nice like Foreman does with its proc file or something is a feature I wouldn't mind seeing in the future. But I'm totally just pie in the sky wishing now. I have no idea if they would ever do something like that.
Yeah.
Background processes seem pretty important to me. Like that's another thing that we do in all of our applications at work. So I would kind of like to see that too. But I think my goals for 3.2 are not so lofty.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would like to see as well is I've dealt with applications that need to connect to more than one database at a time, and that whole process seems a little bit clunky to me. You can still put it in the database.yaml and you can still tell it which connection to use, but it just seems like it I don't know, it kind of exposes the trick behind some of the Rails magic that I wish I just didn't have to think about.
I think one of the things I want to do for 3.2 is like right now in Rails, our base class test case, like if you go all the way down to the base class, it's actually test unit test case. Mm-hmm. And what I want to do is I want to change that to be mini test on the base class. And the reason I want to do that is because you get we've talked about the benefits of mini test, but you'll get the mini test specking stuff for free, basically. So people can have a specking library built in and not have to do anything.
Right.
Hooray for that idea.
Yeah. And you'll also get faster test runs and, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, another thing. Actually, I have a really awesome idea that I want to put in. So do you guys use fixtures in your Rails apps?
No.
Yes.
Sometimes.
No.
No? All right, I do. And maybe we should argue.
I'm with you. No, I'm with you, Aaron.
All right, we can argue about this later. I'm happy to argue about fixtures versus factories, but we use a lot of fixtures, and one thing that sucks is it's slow to load those fixtures into the database. Right? Like that's actually that is the main startup cost to your test run, is loading all those fixtures into the database. So what I want to do is I want to see if I can get those to load into a SQLite database and then cache that loaded database, so that your first run you pay the same cost, but on subsequent runs it'll just copy that previously used SQLite database, so we can get like basically instantaneous startup time to our test runs.
That's a pretty interesting idea, but the downside to that would be the tests will have to run under SQLite, right? So if you use, Postgres specific queries or something, you'd have a problem with that, right?
I think we can do something with other databases.
Yeah, there's actually a plugin, I believe, for the Postgres adapter where it throws all the fixtures in the database, and then I believe it sets a save point. And at the end of each test, it rolls back to the save point after fixtures have been loaded. And my understanding is that's quite a bit faster.
So if we could do that, between test runs, I'm pretty sure there's a way to do it for all databases between test runs. We just have to figure out how to do that, but it should reduce startup time on your test suite like a lot. So it will for us at work anyway.
There's a trick that we started doing at Public Engines that we actually ran into a snag where we were trying to move a bunch of our test data and actually some of our production data, but ideally the idea would be to move all your production data to use MySQL's in-memory tables so that it's all in RAM. And just, there's no disk access, there's just no wait time on that. And we immediately ran into a problem because this was for crimereports.com, and we're doing geocoding and we're doing geographic searching, and the R-tree indexes can't be stored you can only store them in a MyISOM or an InnoDB table. Those are the only two engines. It doesn't support the in-memory engine. And that kind of highlights James's issue, right? Is that if we're developing on MySQL, and there's this Clever Slick plugin that runs on SQLite, that's okay right up until we have a spec that actually checks, database constraint enforcement, that kind of thing. If they're not equivalent between engines, then you run into trouble. But I think that would be really brilliant if you could, find some ways to optionally turn on some performance enhancements and say, yeah, for this subset of the test, we're safe and we can do it. So let's just turn it on and run.
So one of the places I worked, we got all of our tests to run. So what we would do is test on SQLite and then deploy to MySQL, and we got all the tests to run in an in-memory SQLite database. Mm-hmm. But it turns out that didn't actually buy us much time at all.
Really?
Like our main like overhead was loading all the fixtures into the in-memory database, and then from then on, like, we weren't I/O bound at all. We were CPU bound on all of our tests. So putting it in memory didn't do much.
Huh. Interesting. I wonder if that's universal or if that's just where your bottleneck happened to be next.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
I've definitely done some work with the SQLite database where switching to an in-memory database bought me a lot. So it may be that, because of the way Rails runs tests or something, I've never done it in a Rails test suite. So it may be that it's just not effective there. But I can say that SQLite's in-memory database can be lightning quick.
Oh yeah, if you're I/O bound, absolutely, it's insanely fast. But I mean, we were CPU bound, so it didn't help.
We had a sysadmin Nazi from hell, and everything was on VMs, and the VMs were on the same hardware, but they were firewalled from each other through external hardware. So literally, two machines on the same Xen physical machine. 100 kilobyte per second. I mean, just insane I/O binding. Just absolutely insane.
All right. Well,
and that's a separate bottleneck. That's a go attack your IT bottleneck.
All right. Well, I'm gonna bring us back around to Rails. We've kind of gone off on this tangent here.
No, we want all this in 3.2.
Yes.
That's the tieback.
That's awesome. Can we go around the horn on the fixture question? It's a hot topic.
Sure. Go around the horn and say whether or not you use them, or...
Yeah, Aaron, why should we be using fixtures?
So I use fixtures for a few reasons. One is it will be faster than using factories, simply because of the fact that all of your generated data is cached. And the other reason I use it is I don't know. How's that? I like them.
How about you, Peter?
Even when I've used them, I've always found them a little bit verbose to kind of define and work with. But if there were a defense for using them, it would be because DHH likes them. So, that seems to be a common defense now. Like, I use CoffeeScript. Well, DHH uses it. It must be good. This was a common thing that was pulled up during that whole adding CoffeeScript and the SAS thing. It's like, well, DHH likes it. It's his framework. Let's go with it. I have fixtures on some old projects, but I don't use them on new projects. So that probably pretty much spells out my entire opinion of them. But I'm not against them, and I still maintain them on older projects. But they're just not for me now.
So I weighed in and said yes on fixtures. I'm going to qualify that and say that you should use fixtures when they're appropriate. And when should they be appropriate? Well, let me start by saying when they're not appropriate, and that is whenever possible, you should be doing, all your unit tests should be testing the model. They shouldn't be testing, fixture data, et cetera. But a real obvious place where it's obvious to me that you need to be using fixtures is when your database is actually an interface that some other process like a message queue or a data warehouse is pumping data out, and you actually receive data in the database from some other process. It didn't get created and validated by Rails. Rails doesn't own the universe anymore. It's now just one member of a functioning ecosystem, and the data at rest in the database is kind of the API that you have to code against. That's a really good argument to be using fixture data. I will then say that you should only use your fixture data to test the interface of getting data in and out from your database. And then as soon as possible, you should close up that spec bundle, open another one that doesn't use fixtures, and do everything with your models and with factories.
So I used to use fixtures a ton. And I just found I kept getting bit by them. That I would try to test that some page is paginated. So I would look for X number of entries, and then I'd end up making a new fixture somewhere for whatever reason, and then that broke other tests farther away, and maybe that's not even a very good example, but you get the idea. I found that as I had to modify fixtures to do something in one place, then I was breaking things in other places, and it really just got me down. So I did switch to using factories to build them. I do agree that fixtures are faster than factories. However, when I switched to factories, I had this enlightening moment that actually I think ended up making them faster for me. And that was that I don't always need to put it in the database to make the test work. For example, especially in unit tests, a lot of times I have a method that just manipulates some data in the model in some way and shows it to me in a different way. Perhaps it pulls out an inner field and calls 2i or something like that. But the point is, I found that in a lot of cases I could just do, model.new, pass the field to set it at whatever I wanted, and then just call the method after that. And I don't need to save it to the database. So I actually now, whenever I can, I do my testing without involving the database at all. And then when I really do need to involve the database, I go ahead and use a factory to build the object and put it in there. And so because I'm only using factories half the time or so, then it turns out that actually turns into a win. The thing I really do like about factories, and the reason I could never go back, is wiring up associations and fixtures is, to put it nicely, a nightmare. And with factories, it's great. If I have a user factory and then I have an article factory, and an article has an author, then I can just say, association user, and boom, when I create the article, I get the user and everything else I need, so that then I can, pull an email address out or whatever. So that's how I do my tests these days.
Yeah. I need to jump in again, just because I need to go twice, because James just showed me that I'm an idiot that doesn't speak English. I use factories exclusively, and when I'm saying fixtures, I'm actually talking about factories that write to the database. Because James is right, managing associations is just a nightmare. Also, fixtures, especially fixture files on disk, it's very, very. They make it very easy to write yourself into a code smell where, and you touched on this, James, where your test framework suddenly depends on the global state of the entire database, like the number of records in a table. And that's a code smell that I've become really, really sensitive to. And if you're doing that, you need to see if you can't back away from your fixtures a little bit and try to do it more in factories. Yeah,
and my experience is the same as James's, where you have this fixture set and then you change it just a little bit. And, what I did initially when I ran into this problem was I actually ran into a case where I was trying to program around it. So instead of saying there should be 3 records in the database, I would say get the number of records in the database. And then when I create something, check that there's one more. But the problem is then what you get into is, your tests become so complicated that they're not specifying necessarily one state or one path. And so it can get to the point where your tests need to be tested, and
you're still depending on the global state of the database, right?
Right.
Because you do that insert.
That's the whole problem.
You're depending on there not being a collision of a unique key.
Yeah, exactly. So, anyway, it does. It gets painful really quickly.
Have you guys used fixtures since Foxy fixtures came around? Because people complain about hooking them up in hooking up associations, and I really don't see that.
No, I probably haven't. Can you explain to us how Foxy fixtures hooks them up? That would probably be good for people to know.
I have used Foxy and had trouble, but go ahead.
So all it does is it looks at the associations on your models and generates IDs from that. So basically, the fixtures used to be okay, so this model belongs to whatever. So you'd have to put in your fixture file whatever _ ID and then assign it some number. And then then when you're trying to figure out this web of models, you have to keep all these numbers in your head, which is basically impossible.
Yeah.
But we've had all the fixtures have names, right? Like we give the record a name. So what you can do is you say like, well, this is the association, and here's the name of the record it's associated to. So you just provide that name, and then Rails calculates an ID for you and inserts it into the database with that ID. So all you have to do is remember, these are the list of the author, or these are the list of the books for this author, right? And you just put the list of the book names, and it's totally fine for me.
Foxy with a good set of ERB. Like if you're actually leveraging ERB in your fixture files and you're using Foxy fixtures, you're really close to a factory at that point, right? Because you've got dynamic code, you've got interpretation and that sort of thing. And it's just more of a data-driven code model instead of a code-driven model. The one problem I've had with Foxy that is when your database is the interface and somebody else is specifying the IDs of the records. Like, so here's IDs, 1,000 through 1,100. Here's 100 records in this table that came from this, data export. Foxy wants to dictate what the IDs are, and so that can run you into a headache.
Oh yeah, I agree. And honestly, I think the real answer is like we don't. I say I champion fixtures, but the truth is we use a mixture of fixtures and factories where it makes sense to use one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I can see that. I didn't know about the being able to refer to objects by name, so I guess that shows you how long ago I moved away from fixtures. But it definitely does sound better. I just really love with the factories being able to set things, and I love how I can only specify the fields I care about this time
James,
when I'm creating something.
Are you testing your factories?
I do not test my factories. I'm sorry.
I see.
I'll
All right.
go sit in the corner now. Thanks.
I'm going to break in here, and I really want to get us back on topic.
The future of Rails is the database.
Let me tell you the direction of Rails. It is north.
Oh, great.
Not maybe north by northeast.
I don't know. Maybe.
The direction is CoffeeScript.
CoffeeScript. There we go. We'll wind up writing everything in CoffeeScript.
I want to know
wait-
more about this DHH thing, this library that apparently he talked about it at the keynote recently, and he was introducing like the CoffeeScript stuff and that, and he was like, oh yeah, at 37 Signals we're putting together this framework that like heavily uses JavaScript and everything, and then he didn't mention it again. So
what's
I'm
it
intrigued
called?
what that is all about. I never dug into it more after that, but he didn't cover it in any depth. But they're building some JavaScript framework at 37 Signals, and they didn't say much else than that.
I know it's called Cinco, but
Yes.
that's all I know.
That's the one.
Yeah, it's supposed to be mobile aware or something, so that you can. I guess it's the JavaScript framework that they're using in their Rails apps, so that when you access the 37 Signals apps like Basecamp from your mobile phone, that the touch interface and stuff works and things like that. That was my understanding, but I could be totally off on that.
What would that buy you over, say, using jQuery Touch?
Good question. I don't know. And I don't know that they've released a lot of details about Cinco, to be honest. But I think that is one thing that is relevant to where Rails is headed, is the mobile arena. We've been building our apps for web browsers for so long, and then we have these mobile web browsers that have these teeny tiny screens, and not the traditional mouse interface. It's touch, or if you tap it twice, or if you touch it long or hold it or whatever, it does different things. And so the interface that people are using to access our Rails apps isn't as well defined as it would be for a traditional browser app. I'm a little curious too as to if there are specific features in the upcoming Rails versions that handle that. Does anyone know anything about that?
Well, I think what's going to happen is we're going to get better. I think Rails is going to become much better at providing APIs. Like I'm not, I'm speaking very vaguely here because I don't really, it's kind of a foggy idea in my mind. But I think like the future of web is going to become more and more client-side JavaScript based, I think. And that means that Rails applications are going to have to be really good at serving up that JavaScript, but then providing APIs for that JavaScript too. So
Right.
I'm not sure exactly, like specifically how that's going to affect the framework, but it's absolutely something that we have to think about going forward.
Yeah.
I have a question along those same lines, and boy, I really hope the answer isn't "duh, Dave." It's already in Rails,
Dave.
but yeah, it's anyway. Learn the libraries, right? Anyway, one direction that I'm seeing applications moving is they're moving away from REST, from the representational state model, to persistent connection, live streaming, long duration sockets, that sort of thing. And my understanding with Rails right now is that that's a bad idea because the processes are big and cumbersome. And so what you really want to do is proxy them out to something lightweight that can maintain that persistent socket. Is that the case in Rails? And if it is the case in Rails, where will we go in the future? Will we see an easy plugin ability like with Rack to roll it out to something? Will we see something in Rails itself, like active thingy, that will let you persist that?
Active thingy.
Yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about like you connect to a mapping application and you get real-time locations of like everybody near you, and you're constantly sending AJAX updating your geocoded location, and so is everyone else, and you're getting those things. And so it doesn't make sense to do that with REST and a pull, constantly reloading the web page. You just want a socket that's going to stream you, token 4 has moved to this location.
Right, you're talking about WebSockets.
Right,
Yes.
basically.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I was going with my earlier pie in the sky request that I probably didn't explain very well. That basically what I was saying is I think nowadays we always have those extra things, whether it's for background processing, which was just the first thing that popped into my head, or your more current example of web sockets or whatever. We always need that extra environment running, feeding us constant information. I think you're right that's definitely where the web is going, and so hopefully where Rails is going too.
Now, doesn't Rails come with a streaming API? Is that not something that you could use in a similar way? I know it's not a socket, but it's
I can't. It's not exactly the same as doing WebSockets, if I remember correctly. I don't. Well, I probably don't remember. But it's basically the way the streaming works is you do have a socket open to the Rails process. Well, actually, that's not even true. You have a socket open to the proxy. So, for example, our setup is Nginx in front of Unicorn, and on the back end, Unicorn always uses closed connections back to the Nginx proxy. But the web browser keeps a persistent connection open with Nginx. Mm-hmm. So what happens is you keep the socket open, and then you send a request over the socket, and then Nginx decides who to delegate that to and requests it from Unicorn, which is okay because hopefully your connection between Nginx and Unicorn should be very fast. Mm-hmm. So you don't need to worry about latency there. But Nginx and Unicorn don't keep a socket open, but the client and Nginx keep the socket open and do multiple requests per socket. But this doesn't handle doing push data back to the user like, say, WebSockets would do.
right. Huh.
So kind of along those lines, at the local RB meeting, OKRB meeting, one of our members has been working on this library, and I don't remember the name, I'll look it up, but maybe it's Real-Time Rails. But he's been working on this library where when you render a bunch of objects in a page, like, you render a collection of objects, that then it, tracks those IDs, and as it renders them, it sets up a WebSocket to keep track of them and changes on them, and then there's changes happen back on the rails and callbacks, it triggers via the WebSocket, and that data on the page gets updated via the WebSocket. So it's pretty neat stuff, and then you can just render some things around a page, and then it basically live updates as that information becomes available for Rails. It's pretty space agey just to kind of see it in action, and it might be cool for Rails to look at something like that in the future.
It looks like WebSockets are HTTP, so yeah, we could do this. It's possible.
So I guess the other question is we're increasingly getting into a world where everything connects to everything, and so and Aaron brought this up with the APIs, better handling of APIs. What ideas do you have as far as what Rails could do better with providing APIs for external resources and accessing external APIs for its resources?
Ooh, honestly, I can't, it's difficult for me to imagine right now because it's pretty easy today, for providing JSON APIs and whatnot. But I just think we need to push the boundary of how easy it is to set up APIs and get good APIs up and running. I'm just not sure how yet.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I'm designing them, I always, and maybe this is backwards, I don't know, but I always start with the URL, and then I work it out from that, how I want it to work and function. The URLs that I'm going to hit as part of the API, and I almost kind of wish there was a way to make Rails router work like that. Like I could sketch out a URL scheme and have it, do certain things based on what I sketched out, but I'm not exactly sure what that would look like and stuff. That's just kind of the on paper step I have to do beforehand to get ready for it. It would be kind of cool if that just was rolled in as part of the router or something.
Well,
go ahead.
They don't frequently change that routing API, so
right.
Yeah, probably one thing I think would be good is if there was a standard, easy way in Rails to do API versioning. That's.
Oh yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that could be generalized to, for example, you could have a component in your URL and your routing, basically, where that component represents different versions, and because of that, you could, I don't know, do something, send it to a different controller, do something based on that action. Maybe even it's as simple as setting a variable or something somewhere that you can check against which one you're supposed to be handling or something. But that's kind of an interesting point and a very good point. That's something people always end up doing manually.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we are almost out of time. I want to ask one more question. And I really just want a quick answer, unless, well, you can take as long as you want to answer, I guess. But is Rails harder to use now than it was when you learned to program in Rails?
Yes.
No. Can we get a maybe?
We covered it.
No.
No. Okay, so we heard one yes and two no's. Peter, why do you think it's harder to learn?
I guess perhaps I'm less focused on the why and just the fact that when I've been teaching people, I've just noticed a lot more kind of friction with people that I've been trying to teach in recent times than a long time ago. And I don't know whether that's because I'm now further away from that, having been through the learning experience myself or not. But there are just a lot more things that people need to juggle mentally to get a grip on it. And I think James possibly touched on it earlier when he said about the move to the RESTful URLs, for example. There was a time when it was all a lot more kind of Sinatra-esque in the way that you just defined every, you could either have that pattern or you could just go into the routes file and define every single route separately if you wanted to, even though that's obviously not a great idea. We know that now. To people who are coming into it new, they kind of, they like things like that. They like to get up and running, and then they'll start to learn the best practices, which I think is probably how a lot of us learn. It's how I learned. My, initial Rails code was absolutely abysmal. It wasn't following best practices at all, and it's got better over time. So, I think perhaps there is this emphasis now on doing things in quite a structured, proper way of doing things, and it's a lot harder to fall off the rails, as it were.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Aaron,
Peter, I'm also going to suggest that part of your problem, just a hypothesis, might be market fatigue. I think you've taught all the smart people, and so this is to be expected.
So now we have all
those
PHP
dummies.
developers.
Ouch.
So Dave and Aaron, is it then easier to learn, or is it the same?
I'll give mine real quick, and then Aaron can give the definitive one. I think there's more stack to learn, but I think it's easier to come to. Like Rails has kind of lowered the entry point of there's a lot more magic, which means there's a lot more opinions, but that means there's also a lot more convention. So you can sit down and you can start, and now you can build your blog in 12 minutes instead of in 15. But there is a lot more stack to learn. So I mean, I fair point that if you really want to master Rails from top to bottom, I think there's going to be more to do. But just to pick it up and run with it, I think it's simpler.
Yeah, that's basically that's what I was going to say. Is I think we have stuff like Bundler, which get your dependencies all installed and ready to go for you. Like this seems much easier than it used to be in the bad old days. And but I think it's easier to get up and running. I just think it's harder to master.
Right. Okay.
So,
I will say that while I mostly agree with what Peter said, he basically echoed my thoughts perfectly. But I do agree with some of what Aaron said too. And like, for example, when Bundler came out at first, I think I really didn't know what to think about it. And the more I use it, the more I'm just convinced it is the best thing that ever happened to Rails applications. Mm-hmm. Because you put it on the server, you bundle, install, and just forget about it, And I'm currently in my job right now moving an old Rails application up to Rails 3, and just the dependency management to get that old application running on my computer was amazing. I can't believe we used to do that regularly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Let's go ahead and jump into the picks. We'll go ahead and start. Let's go alphabetical this time. Go ahead, Aaron.
Amazon Prime, get it. I don't know. I actually so one of my hobbies is sausage making. And
you got to do something with those mushrooms, huh?
Yes, exactly. And I wanted a smoker so that I could smoke my sausages, and I bought it on Amazon with Amazon Prime, and it will show up tomorrow. So I am extremely happy with this service. So yes.
Okay.
I have to agree with that. That's like one of my best company write-offs ever.
What do you get for it? I know you get 2-day shipping. Is there anything else to it that you like?
2-day shipping for free is the thing that can't be beat.
Yeah, and I think like basically 2-day shipping for free is just so good, and for the price, like it will pay for itself when Christmas rolls around.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. All right. Was there anything else? We all kind of chimed in on you.
No, that's it.
Okay. I think I'm next. I've had a few people ask me what I use for my podcast recording, and so I'm just going to throw a few things out there for that. The first one that I use is I do all my hosting at libsyn.com. That's libsyn.com, and it's a paid service, but basically it takes away all of my worries about bandwidth. And it gets the downloads done pretty fast. Another thing that I'm doing is the recording that I'm doing goes into a digital audio recorder, and I'm doing a Skype Mix Minus over an iMic, and it goes into the digital audio recorder, which is an Edirol RH09 or whatever. It's the HD version of the Edirol, which they don't make anymore. Now you have to get the 05 or something. But anyway, the Edirol is really nice because it actually has a microphone on the top. So I can actually just walk outside, hold it up by my face, and I can just talk into it. It records it all to an SD card that I can either put into my computer, or I just plug the USB cable in more often than not, and it takes care of that for me. And then on my iPad, I'm using an app called Resounder to queue up the music and stuff. And so, and that's pretty much it. The only other piece of hardware I've got is my microphone, which I'm not super fond of, so I'm not going to tell you what it is. And I'm using the Behringer Xenix 802 mixer, and it's awesome. So I'll put links to all that equipment in the show notes. And if you're thinking about starting a podcast, all you really need is a microphone and and some software to record. But if you want to get all fancy, then that's what I'm using. I guess Dave's next.
Okay, yeah. So I was deathly ill last week, and I've actually been sick for about the past 3 weeks. And so if you are listening to this podcast through the wonders of modern technology, you probably have access to my pick, which is first world medicine. The past 3 weeks, I have been absolutely wonderful and grateful for expectorants, antihistamines, decongestants, and antibiotics. And in specifically, I want to give a big shout out to my good friend amoxicillin, 500 milligrams, 2 tablets twice a day until the infection in my lungs goes away.
Oh man!
So yeah, shout out for doctors everywhere. Thank you.
And that was a public service announcement
That's
to
right.
vaccinate your children.
That's my dude, don't even start with me. Vaccinate your freaking kids. Yeah, get over your freaking superstitions and vaccinate.
What are you
your
talking
kids.
about? That's how the government controls us. You didn't know this?
Come
on.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it causes autism.
that's right.
Oh man,
Right.
now we're really gonna get flamed.
If we don't get hate mail over that, vaccines do not cause autism. Go vaccinate your kids.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, really, go read the science. Anyway, James, what are your picks?
So a couple of years ago, I declared war on Photoshop, and I think I'm losing because I've replaced it with about 5 programs instead of the one that I used to use. But I'm much happier now, so that's how I tell myself it's okay. But anyways, I've learned some cool things along the way as I do it, and I'm going to have to recommend at least 2 of the programs that I used to replace it. I used Pixelmator for a while, and it has kind of a nice interface and stuff, but there were always some things I'm lacking, so I always had to go to Acorn to do the other things that I couldn't do in Pixelmator. And then as time goes on, I've learned that I'm just doing everything I need in Acorn, so it's finally come up and taking care of those things. It's not as sexy as Pixelmator, but it's definitely functional. It's got great filters and stuff in it now, so if you want a graphics program that's not like insanely draconian, I recommend Acorn. And then the other graphics program that I've actually just used back since like the Mac OS 9 days and can't get over is Graphic Converter. And that program is just absolutely, I swear I've thrown images at that I have no idea what are. Even if I see a file, I don't even know what it is. I usually just try to open it in Graphic Converter first, because even if it's Bob's image format, Graphic Converter opens it. It's like they have a time machine and they went into the future and predicted all possible image formats, and all of them are already in Graphic Converter, and they were like 15 years ago. So it's amazing. You can open anything with it, I swear. So Graphic Converter and Acorn are 2 of the tools I use to avoid ever supporting Photoshop again.
So I have to chime in here and let you know, James, that I have a James Picks tally going. It's currently at $30. If I hadn't already upgraded Acorn, it'd probably be at $80 right now.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I went and bought one of your games last week. So
Which game?
I bought Lost Cities.
Awesome game. Great choice.
Yeah, it should be in the mail today or tomorrow, so we'll see. I told my wife it was for her, but it's not.
So I'm costing people money now. Now I'm going to feel pressured to find cheap recommendations. That's awesome.
No. Good recommendations. I'm enjoying them. All right, Peter, what are your picks?
You guys are way down in the alphabet, I've just noticed. James, like J, not even halfway. I'm like way out there on my own. Yeah, I just wanted to like second the Amazon Prime one. that Aaron mentioned. Although, just to make you green, here in the UK, what you get for your money is next day guaranteed delivery, just because it's absolutely tiny little island, which means I spent so much money on Prime that actually I kind of hate it in a way. I like it, of course, but the fact is I can just go on there, click, and bang, it's going to be here by midday tomorrow. So up to, I think, 11 p.m. actually, they'll do that. So, yeah, small country, some of the benefits. 20% tax, not so good. Things that I just wanted to, just my actual proper picks. CoffeeScript. You might have noticed I've mentioned this a couple of times. I actually got to play with it last weekend in full. I've literally spent the whole weekend with it at a hack event, putting some stuff together, and I've kind of fallen in love with it. So I'm probably going to end up talking about that more in future, and I've been enjoying that so far. And in terms of an actual project to just point out, I wanted to point out David Dollar's Foreman, because it ties into something that was being mentioned earlier about having managing multiple processes from a Rails app. What you do with Foreman is you can create a file called a proc file, which I believe is a little bit similar to what you can do on the new Heroku stack, although I've not played with that yet. But you can create this proc file where you define all of the different processes that kind of back up your Rails process. So, things like rescue workers and, schedulers and things like that. And then you can run that locally with a Foreman start, and it will start all of those processes and let you see all of the logs of those sort of in a single stream. And then you can actually export it to production, which will export it to Ubuntu's Upstart system or to a normal initd system for rolling it out into production. So this might be something that would be very interesting to see it perhaps become a bit more mature, get more development, and maybe integrate with Rails at some point down the line. So that's pretty much it.
All right.
I think that is what Heroku's using. I may be wrong, but I believe it is what they're using. And it is definitely what I was trying to refer to earlier. Yes, Foreman.
All right. Well, thanks, guys, for another great podcast. I know our audience really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk. We had a major tangent there with the fixtures, but I think there's a lot of good content there. And I think we really did go into some of the things that we're going to see Rails have to deal with one way or the other. Our panelists again today are Aaron Patterson, David Brady.
Howdy.
Peter Cooper.
Totally awesome.
James Edward Gray.
Bye-bye all.
And I'm Charles Max Wood. You can get the show notes at rubyrogues.com. And you can find us in iTunes. And again, just like to ask you to leave us a review and let us know what you think. And
also vote for show topics. Yeah, we took this topic out of the votes. So
yeah, absolutely. This was the top topic. So yeah, go to rubyrogues.com, click request a topic, and then vote something up or add your own in. And that'll do it. We'll catch you next week.